Hey everyone, back to the third part of the Christianity presentation. Um, so we were talking about Matthew, and so when we get into the Christmas story for Matthew, you see that Joseph is the main character. Joseph, the foster father of Jesus. So Mary is engaged to Joseph, and she's found with child. Doesn't really have any of the experience with the angel or anything like that. So she just comes up pregnant, right? And Joseph is the main character, and he has his dream, right? To even though she's having this baby and it's not his, he's to take it as his own, right? So Joseph has this dream. Well, boy, if the reference is to Old Testament, then we also remember the story of Joseph and his dreams in Egypt, right? And so that's a reference that the 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 Christian, the early Jewish Christians who were reading this for the first time would have gotten right away. So Jesus is just born in Bethlehem. There's no journey there. There's no census, no manger, no donkey. He's just born there. And this is where we come to the Magi, right? These three gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they come and visit him, and they bring these gifts, and they have a dream saying, like, you have to go now and sneak away to Egypt because King Herod, King Herod the Great, is ready to kill the baby. Okay, so back up. Who's King Herod? King Herod was the king of Judea at the time, and the prophecy that that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem comes from the prophet Micah. And Herod knew this. Now, Herod, in history, and there are several biographies of him, very, very detailed biographies of King Herod. He built up a lot of the different cities and stuff like that. He rebuilt the temple in order to get on the good side of the people because he came to power and he didn't belong to the right house. And so people didn't really see him as a legit king, but he wanted to be a legit king. So he went out of his way to follow all like the dietary laws and whatever. But he was also very paranoid, and he killed many people in his court thinking that they were out to get him, including many of his sons. The actual interesting line that was popular back then was that it was safer to be a pig in King Herod's barn than it was his own son, right? Because he wouldn't touch the pig. He wanted to keep the dietary laws, but he wouldn't mind killing his own sons. So he was paranoid about people trying to take his power. And so basically, as the story goes, if you read in the Gospels, Herod hears that the Magi had crossed over and that there was going to be a king, so he had his paranoia, struck up again, and he sent his soldiers to go to Bethlehem and murder all of the children ages 2 and under, right, in order to make sure that this child that was born, this king, this new king that was to be born, um, wouldn't survive. And this is terrible. It's called the murder of the innocents, and it's a terrible thing that happened. Except that when you look at all the biographies of King Herod, guess what? They're not there, right? If he fired a baker, right, or if he, you know, spit the wrong way, it's in these biographies, very detailed. But yet, don't you think that if he went to a town and had his soldiers butcher all the children from that town, that would have its own special chapter at least? And so the idea that so, but it's not in any of these biographies. So it's what scholars are thinking here. And think about this: when was the last time you ever heard about a situation where a king goes and kills all the children in an effort to make sure that he stays in power, and that one of these children sneaks away and goes up into Egypt and eventually saves his people, right? It's the Moses story. where Moses was, taken away in the little basket, and he becomes a prince of Egypt, right? So he goes deeper into Egypt, and then leads his people. He comes out of Egypt in order to save his people. So it's the story is almost embarrassingly the same. So did the murder of the innocents happen? Probably not historically, but it's part of the story. It's part of this idea of connecting Jesus as a new Moses. So after Herod dies, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph return to Galilee, and there's another dream and another prophecy that they have to, that come around. So these connections to the Old Testament, and Matthew does this again and again and again in his gospel. If you look at Luke, you see the other, you see the other um, infancy narrative, and this starts out very differently, right? It starts out in the temple where John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, is in the temple, and he is one of the most prominent priests in all of Judaism, right? And an angel comes and announces that he's going to have a son, but he's really old and his wife's really old, so there's no way they should be having a kid. So he doubts the angel, right? And for this, the angel makes him mute until the baby is born. Then the next story is the same angel appearing to Mary, this young girl, insignificant in Jewish society. Not only that, but she's from Galilee, so that's like the backwater. So that would be like, some girl from like the depths of Mississippi, in completely insignificant. And she says yes to the angel. So you have this comparison of the rich, um, being denied, belief and faith, where the poor all have a special place. And that, again, this is the theme of Luke. The poor and the outcast are lifted up, right? So in this story, you have this is where you're going to have um, the birth, whether you have the census and the journey to Bethlehem and no room at the inn. You're going to have your mangers and your shepherds and your animals. This is as lowly a birth as you could give. And so Jesus, and again, the first people who are welcome to come see the baby are not the three great kings, as in Matthew, but the lowly shepherds who never washed when we're out in the fields, and so they were almost seen as unclean. And the angels come to them and invite them to the manger. So in this instance, that would have that was stood out to the people reading the Gospel of Luke for the first time. That really, it's the shepherds that are welcome. That's crazy. And so you see a contrasting themes of Matthew and Luke in regards to the infancy narratives. So in our next topic, we'll talk more about get into the ministry of Jesus.